August 10, 1944. The shoreline of Tinian was still smoking. Piles of shattered helmets, blackened corpses, and sun-baked uniforms lay scattered along the trench line, stiff with dried blood and dust. Flies swarmed. The air reeked of cordite, sewage, and something deeper, defeat. In a crater behind what had once been a machine gun nest, 23 Japanese soldiers huddled in silence. Most were wounded, some so severely that their eyes rolled with fever and shock, others with injuries carefully bound with strips of their own uniforms. The youngest among them, Private Kazuo Mori, had not spoken in 2 days. He sat with his knees to his chest, fingers clenched around the broken remains of an Arisaka rifle. No rounds left. They had run out of water the night before. Their company was gone. Their commanding officer had committed suicide at dawn after writing a final report in blood on a tattered flag. Every one of them had heard the gunshot echo through the trench. No one flinched. At dusk, the Americans began advancing. Kazuo expected it to end with a boot across the face, a bullet in the head, bayonets, fists, maybe worse. All of them had heard the stories. Americans took no prisoners. They torched pillboxes. They machine-gunned the wounded. That was the war they'd been trained to believe in. But when the Americans came, the sound they brought wasn't thunder. It was footsteps, shouted English, and then something even stranger. Women's voices. Soft, calm, calling names that didn't belong on this battlefield. Hey, we got live ones. Medic over here, this one's bleeding out. Don't move, we've got you. Then a pair of boots stopped in front of Kazuo. His eyes opened, squinting in the sunlight, half expecting the heel to crash into his face. Instead, a silhouette knelt beside him. Not a Marine, not a corpsman. A woman. American, blonde, kneeling down in the middle of a war zone, holding a canteen. She didn't flinch when she saw the blood on his uniform, the wild fear in his eyes, or the way he shrank from her like she was a ghost. She just unscrewed the top and held it out. Drink, she said. Kazuo stared at her hand for what felt like an eternity. Then, without understanding why, he drank. The water was warm, but it tasted like life. At the field hospital set up behind the American line, the chaos moved in 2 rhythms. One was mechanical stretchers, morphine, triage charts, clean gauze. The other was human groans, sobs, whispered prayers. The Japanese wounded were kept in a separate tent, not because they were hated, but because no one knew what would happen. They were still enemies, still soldiers of an empire sworn to die rather than surrender. Some had tried to bite through their own tongues. Others had refused food. But then came the nurses. Lieutenant Helen Graves had been on New Guinea, Saipan, now Tinian. She had seen limbs blown off, faces torn open, eyes burned to jelly. But when she walked into the Japanese ward, it was the silence that unnerved her most. None of the men spoke, not to the doctors, not to the corpsmen, not even to each other. Their eyes followed every movement. Their fingers clenched blankets like lifelines. They waited for punishment. She walked past one man with his leg wrapped in layers of bandage, shrapnel wounds, ugly ones. His eyes locked on her like a prisoner watching a firing squad. She crouched down beside him. "I'm Lieutenant Graves," she said. "I'm here to clean your wounds." He didn't answer. She gently lifted the edge of the gauze. His breath caught. It wasn't pain, it was confusion. He had been waiting for the strike, for the scream, for someone to spit in his face. But instead, this woman, this American woman, was sponging his wounds with saline and murmuring something he didn't understand. The touch was careful, professional, human. He cried not from pain, from something else. Days passed. The wounded began to speak in whispers, broken Japanese, halting English, not conversations, just questions. Why not kill? Why woman here? You nurse. Helen answered in the same calm voice each time. Because you're wounded. Because you surrendered. Because that's what we do. Not all nurses treated enemy soldiers. Not all could stomach it. But the ones who did, Helen, Susan, Margaret, brought something onto the battlefield that no rifle, no flag, no general could replicate. They brought mercy. The Japanese soldiers didn't know the word, not in the American sense, but they felt it. Corporal Nishida, whose right hand had been shattered by grenade shrapnel, had expected the medics to amputate without anesthesia. Instead, they gave him morphine. He awoke in a clean cot, hands splinted, bandaged, preserved. He stared at his arm for nearly 20 minutes. Then he looked up at the nurse beside him and asked, "Why help?" She didn't understand the question. He realized, maybe for the first time, neither did he. Rumors spread through the Japanese lines, still holding out in the caves beyond the beaches. Men whispered to each other during the night. They didn't shoot prisoners. They gave water, medicine. Women came, American nurses. At first, officers dismissed the stories as cowardice, propaganda, but more and more men disappeared into American custody and didn't come back in pieces. They came back with clean bandages. One night, while the ward was quiet and the lamps buzzed with generator hum, Kazuo woke screaming. He thought he was back in the trench, that the air was on fire again, that the nurse's hands on his chest were the hands of an enemy bayoneting him through the ribs. Helen held him until he stopped trembling. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, brushing sweat-soaked hair from his forehead like he was her younger brother, not a soldier trained to kill Americans. He sobbed into her uniform. She let him. The war raged on, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But something had changed, even in the darkness. There were fewer suicides among prisoners. Fewer refused treatment. More Japanese soldiers emerged from their bunkers waving scraps of white cloth, not because they had lost hope, but because hope had been handed to them in a metal canteen by a woman who should have hated them. No propaganda prepared them for that. The American Field Hospital outside Tinian's southern ridge was a grid of green canvas and wooden frames stretched under an iron sun. By week's end, the nurses knew every corner of it, every collapsed cot, every stretcher with its wheels stuck in coral sand, every field bottle of iodine half-crusted with heat and dust. Lieutenant Helen Graves stopped recognizing the difference between day and night. Shift changes were a myth. There was only now and next. One afternoon, she stood in the surgical tent, elbow-deep in blood, holding gauze to a Marine's side while the doctor stapled him together. Outside, someone screamed, a sound she knew belonged to a prisoner. Helen stepped out, gloves off, apron still stained, and saw two corpsmen holding down a Japanese soldier convulsing in the dirt. His leg was splinted. His eyes were rolled back. Corpsman Bradley looked up, seizure, heat stroke. Helen moved fast, calling for water, morphine, rags. When the soldier's eyes fluttered open, they didn't see enemies. They saw her. The same nurse who had stitched his thigh. The same one who had handed him water through cracked lips 3 nights before. He didn't speak, just reached up and clutched her wrist, as if her presence alone might keep him from falling back into whatever nightmare he was clawing away from. Helen didn't speak either. She just let him hold on. Across the ward, Private Kazuo Mori sat with his back against a canvas cot. He had recovered enough to walk. Slowly. He kept to himself, but he watched everything. Watched the nurses tending to men who had once charged their beaches. Watched them bind wounds, carry bedpans, offer the smallest comforts to prisoners who'd been told they were no longer human. He had heard whispers among the Marines, too. Not cruelty, just confusion. Ware we patchin', up the bastards that shot at us. They'd never do the same for us. Leave 'em, let 'em rot. But then came the counterpoint, always from the nurses. They're still wounded. They surrendered. They're human. The word human didn't mean the same thing to everyone in 1944, especially not in a war like this. But Helen, and others like her, carried that word like a shield. That night, Helen sat outside the tent with a mug of weak coffee and a cigarette she barely smoked. Sergeant Riley, a Marine medic with hands like sandpaper and a jaw that never seemed to unclench, slumped beside her. "You know," he said after a long silence, "some of these guys, they were at the Tenaru. They watched their buddies get bayoneted in their sleep. Some got buried alive in caves, burned in bunkers. No mercy." Helen didn't respond. He looked at her. "So why do you keep going in there with them?" She exhaled smoke and stared out toward the sea. "Because I was sent here to keep people alive, not decide who deserves it." Riley grunted. "You think any of them would do the same for you?" "No," she said. "That's what makes it matter." In the Japanese ward, Kazuo watched another prisoner die. An older man, probably once a sergeant. He had lost too much blood from a stomach wound that never stopped leaking. The nurses did everything they could, morphine, sutures, even attempted field surgery, but the infection won. The man died clutching a photograph of his daughter, taken on the port at Nagasaki. Kazuo listened as the nurses covered his body with a white sheet. They didn't burn it, didn't strip it, didn't mock the photo. They placed it gently over his chest and whispered words he didn't understand. One of the nurses, not Graves, but another, red-haired and tired, placed 2 fingers against the corpse's forehead and made a quiet, reverent gesture. Kazuo had expected that kind of tenderness only for their own. But they gave it to him. The next day an officer arrived. Captain Harold Wainwright, Army Intelligence, clean uniform, pressed boots, a clipboard. He moved through the Japanese ward like someone inspecting livestock. He asked questions: who speaks English, who was at what position, who had maps. The prisoners answered slowly, cautiously, watching the guards. When Wainwright reached Kazuo, he crouched, looked him over and asked, "Did you carry messages?" Kazuo nodded once. "Did you ever fire your weapon?" Another nod. "Did you kill any Americans?" Kazuo stared into the man's eyes and said nothing. Wainwright stood. No point wasting resources, this one's not going to talk. But as he turned, Helen stepped into the doorway. "He's talking," she said flatly, "just not to you." Wainwright raised an eyebrow. "You think these people are gonna give you anything but silence?" Helen didn't answer. He gestured at the ward. "These aren't your boys, Lieutenant. You're patching up the enemy." "Then they're the enemy who's not dying today," she said. "That's what makes us different." Wainwright paused, then left without another word. Weeks passed. The war moved forward. Tinian became a launch pad for something greater, darker. The airfield lengthened. Bombers came, B-29s, hundreds of them, their bellies loaded with destruction. The POW camp near the southern hills expanded. More Japanese filtered in from broken caves, burned bunkers, some on stretchers, some limping under white flags. And still the nurses worked. They learned names, spoke fragments of Japanese, gestures bridged the rest. Kazuo began helping not because anyone asked, but because something inside him changed. He passed water, cleaned trays, helped an amputee to the latrine. He still flinched when a guard barked, still dreamed of explosions, still woke in sweats. But now he also remembered soft voices, gauze soaked in iodine, a woman who held his hand as he screamed through the pain. One morning, a young Marine with bandages across his ribs sat beside Kazuo outside the mess tent. They didn't speak, didn't need to, just passed a cigarette back and forth, nodding. The Marine offered a piece of chocolate wrapped in wax paper. Kazuo stared at it, then took it. The sweetness burned his tongue. It was the first sugar he'd tasted in a year. He nearly wept. In the distance, a new plane roared overhead. bigger than the others, sleek, silver, a B-29. It banked toward the horizon, east, toward Japan. No one in the camp knew what it carried, not yet. But Kazuo felt something heavy in his gut. The war was not over. But it had changed. And somewhere in that change, a nurse had sat beside him in the dirt, offered him water, and treated his wounds not like a soldier, but like a man. Kazuo Mori awoke before sunrise. The camp was still. The jungle behind the ridgeline whispered under wind, and the tents stretched like tired lungs across the flattened coral plain. He stood slowly. His legs still ached from the shrapnel wound, but he could walk now. The nurses had stopped treating him like a patient days ago, not because he was healed, but because he no longer needed to be watched. He passed by the cots quietly, brushing past other prisoners still asleep. He paused when he reached a man named Akabe, an older sergeant who had tried to hang himself with medical gauze 2 weeks ago. He slept now, peacefully, a rosary clutched in his hand. Kazuo moved on. At the edge of the hospital perimeter, a Marine guard looked up from a magazine and gave a half-salute with 2 fingers. Kazuo bowed. Neither of them said anything. They didn't have to. The world had shifted too far for small talk. By mid-morning, the field hospital was humming again. New stretchers arrived from the beach, sunburned Marines from fresh landings on other islands, one missing a foot, another crying out for his mother. Helen Graves stood over one of them, wrist deep in blood, pressing gauze into an open wound that wouldn't stop leaking. A young corpsman held the IV bag above her head as she barked for more clamps. "I said metal forceps, not rubber-tipped," she snapped. The corpsman fumbled. Another nurse stepped in. The room moved like an orchestra, barely keeping tempo. In the corner, Kazuo watched it all unfold. He wasn't supposed to be inside the American casualty tent, but no one stopped him anymore. He was quiet. He moved carefully. He never touched the weapons, never approached the surgeons. He just passed things, towels, water, iodine bottles, with the delicacy of someone who knew what pain sounded like. Helen didn't notice him at first, but when the bleeding finally slowed, when the Marine passed into morphine-drenched unconsciousness, she turned and found Kazuo at her elbow, offering her a clean cloth. She took it without thinking. Then she looked at him. He nodded once, then left. That night a storm rolled across the Pacific. The tents creaked under wind. Lightning flickered behind the hills, illuminating the hospital in white bursts. Rain fell sideways, soaking through tarps and canvas. Most prisoners huddled in silence. A few prayed, a few just listened. Inside the nurses' mess tent, the conversation had turned, not about medicine, not about war, but about what came next. "They'll never forgive us," one said, "not after what we did to Tokyo." "Forgiveness isn't the point," Helen answered. "Stopping the dying is." Another nurse shook her head. "You really think they'll go home and forget any of this? The bayonets, the flamethrowers, the camps?" "No," Helen said, "but maybe they'll remember something else too." The next morning, word came down. The war was reaching its end. A new bomb, something beyond comprehension, had destroyed a city called Hiroshima. One plane, one payload. Some of the nurses wept, some just stared. Helen said nothing. She just walked into the Japanese ward and resumed her rounds. Kazuo heard the whispers, a city gone, tens of thousands vaporized. He didn't believe it, couldn't, but he saw it in the Marines' faces. Something had changed. Later that week, another city, Nagasaki. The rumors stopped being rumors. Kazuo stopped sleeping. The camp swelled with new arrivals. Hundreds of Japanese poured in from ravines, from caves, from burned-out hillsides. Some carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others came dragging the wounded. None resisted. The guards barely had to speak anymore. The Japanese lined up. They obeyed. not out of submission but out of some deeper, exhausted understanding. One of them, a former officer, saluted Helen when she passed. She nodded, expression unreadable. Then came the message. August 15, 1945. The Emperor had spoken. Japan was surrendering. The nurses gathered around the field radio. The static cleared, and the recording played in hollow tones none of them understood. But the translators confirmed it. The war was over. There was no cheering, no dancing, only silence. Helen looked down at her blood-stained uniform and thought, "We made it." Then she thought of the ones who didn't. That night Kazuo sat by the perimeter fence. He looked out toward the sea, where the silhouettes of destroyers flickered in the moonlight. He thought of his father, of the cherry blossom trees behind their house, of the bayonet drills, the shrines, the endless speeches about glory. None of it matched the tent he now sat in. He watched Helen walk past, clipboard in hand. She didn't see him. She was too focused, checking bandages, murmuring to an unconscious Marine. She didn't act like someone who had just won a war. She acted like someone trying to undo one. A week later, the Japanese prisoners were processed for relocation. Camp records were filed, transfers arranged. Kazuo stood in a line of men, holding a folded blanket and a packet of medical instructions he couldn't read. As he approached the table, a voice called his name. He turned. Helen was there, arms crossed. "I thought you were gone," she said. He bowed deeply, lower than any salute he had ever given. Then, after a long moment, he looked up and spoke carefully, syllable by syllable. "Thank you for my life." She blinked once, then nodded. "Don't waste it," she said. They never saw each other again. But decades later, in a village outside Kyoto, a letter arrived at a VA hospital in Minnesota. It was addressed to Helen Graves. Inside, a photograph, a man in his 70s standing beside a small clinic in rural Japan. Below it, in uneven English. "I become nurse too. I help others like you help me. I remember every day." There was no signature, just a date. And a word Helen hadn't heard in years. Arigato. The first snow fell in the hills above Kyoto in the winter of 1946. It wasn't thick, just enough to dust the rooftops and settle between stones of the courtyard path. The wind carried smoke from the village chimneys and the smell of broth, but Kazuo Mori didn't notice. He was too focused on tying the bandage. The boy in front of him, 9 years old, gaunt, trembling, had stepped on a rusted nail behind a bombed-out warehouse. The foot was red, swollen, streaked with dirt. His mother hovered nearby, eyes wide, arms folded against her chest. Kazuo cleaned the wound slowly, gently. The boy hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. When Kazuo wrapped the cotton around the foot and secured it with tape, he paused and said, in soft, halting Japanese, "You were very brave." He'd heard those words once in English, from a woman whose name he hadn't spoken in months, but whose face lived behind his eyes every time he unrolled gauze. When the boy stood and limped away, clinging to his mother's hand, Kazuo stood alone in the clinic doorway, breathing in the frozen air. He no longer wore a uniform. He wore a plain white coat. His left leg still ached in cold weather, and he walked with a slight limp, but his hands had learned gentleness. He did not carry a rifle. He carried iodine, thread, and memory. Back in 1945, months before the first snow would settle over Kyoto, Kazuo had boarded a transport ship from Saipan under American watch. The ship had no name, just a code, stencil painted in fading black. Inside were rows of former soldiers, some silent, some hollowed by guilt, some still clinging to the old code, the old emperor, the idea that this was a temporary setback. But not Kazuo. He had packed no belongings, just the dog tag the Americans had given him, stamped with a number and nothing else, and a small linen cloth bearing a nurse's initials, HG. He carried it in his chest pocket, not as a token, as a reminder that mercy existed, that it had once been offered to him freely by the enemy. That kind of thing changes a man. The repatriation port at Uraga was smoke-choked and filled with silence. No cheering, no welcome, just lines of thin men disembarking in ragged uniforms, blinking under banners that once promised glory, now fluttering in defeat. Kazuo stepped onto the dock and saw the old country with new eyes. The ash in the air, the scorched buildings, the stares from civilians who didn't know whether to hate or mourn. He did not return to the old neighborhood. It had been flattened, the cherry trees uprooted, his father gone. Instead, he walked for days, south, then east, then north again, until he reached the outskirts of a village where an old schoolhouse had been turned into a clinic by a priest and a widow with a nursing background. They let him sleep on the floor the first week, on a cot the second, and by the third he was cleaning tools and sterilizing bandages. No one asked about the war, no one needed to. But they noticed how gently he held the children when they cried. One afternoon, a group of former soldiers came through the village, men who had served in Manchuria, loud, bitter. One of them, face half burned, jaw crooked from a bullet, recognized Kazuo's limp and demanded to know where he'd served. Kazuo answered honestly. "Tinian." The man spat. "You let the enemy take you." "I survived," Kazuo said. "No, you surrendered." There was nothing else after that. The man walked on, disgust curling his lips. But an old woman, sitting near the clinic, called Kazuo over after the men had gone. "My son died in the Philippines," she said. "He never came back." Kazuo bowed his head. "I'm sorry." She studied him for a long time. "You're the first soldier I've seen come back and help someone." Then she handed him a bowl of rice. No one in the village questioned his presence again. That spring, Kazuo planted a single cherry blossom sapling outside the clinic door. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. When it bloomed white. Across the ocean in Minnesota, Helen Graves sat in a government hospital, quietly sorting through patient charts. She had returned home with a service medal, a limp in her right hand from shrapnel, and a silence most people couldn't break. The patients loved her, called her Miss Graves even when she insisted on first names, said her hands were steady, said her voice was calming. She never talked about the Pacific, not to her family, not to reporters, not even to the other nurses, most of whom had been stationed in Europe. But once a month, she wrote a letter she never mailed. It always began the same way. To the boy with the broken leg, who learned to stand again. In Tokyo, the new constitution was being written. The Americans set up hospitals, schools, factories. Rebuilding began. But beneath it all there was tension, a cultural fracture not easily healed. Helen returned in 1948 as part of a civilian medical team. She landed in Yokohama, uncertain what she would find, uncertain why she had come. She told herself it was about duty, but when the train rolled through Kyoto, she asked to step off. She didn't know the address, only a vague name, a village near the hills, something she'd seen once, written on a tag years ago when she'd helped process repatriated prisoners. She walked for hours, stopping only when she saw the tree. White blossoms, and a small wooden sign that read, Mori Clinic. Inside, she found Kazuo washing his hands in a basin. He looked up, froze, then wiped his palms and stepped forward, slowly. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They simply bowed to each other. And when Helen finally straightened, she placed a linen cloth on the table. It still bore her initials. Kazuo looked down at it, then up at her, and smiled. The wind in the Kyoto foothills carried the scent of earth and pine when spring returned. The blossoms on the cherry tree outside the clinic bloomed for the third year in a row, pale, delicate things, petals drifting through the open windows where the sick and wounded now came on foot, not stretchers. Kazuo stood near the base of the tree one morning, trimming a low branch with a pair of worn garden shears. His coat sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His hands, once calloused from rifle drills and trench walls, now bore only the light, faded scars of sterilizer and suture thread. The clinic was small, no more than 3 rooms and a storage shed. But it was known. Across districts, mothers brought their children to him. Farmers brought their old parents. Sometimes soldiers came, silent men in their 30s and 40s who didn't speak until the door closed behind them. They never asked if he had served. They didn't need to. They only looked at the way he touched a wound, how gently he held an injured wrist, how he never asked how it happened, only whether it hurt. Inside, on a shelf behind the medicine cabinet, lay a sealed envelope. It had been there since the winter Helen returned. Neither of them had opened it. It hadn't needed to be. Its presence was enough, a weightless reminder of something neither of them had been able to say aloud. Sometimes the memory of her would return like a gust, sudden, piercing, real. He would hear her voice in the clatter of metal bowls, in the rustle of linen, in the quiet between footsteps. She had returned to America, to her hospital, to the world beyond the Pacific, but a part of her remained here, stitched into the cloth banner that still hung in the front room of the clinic, handwritten in both English and Japanese. Life first, always. In Tokyo, the new decade brought new wars, new alliances, new fears, but in the small towns, life stitched itself back together. Schoolyards filled, storefronts reopened. Electricity came in fits and starts, but it came. And slowly, the country began to forget. Not the war, that wound would remain, but the details, the names, the long nights in tunnels, the hunger that tightened around the ribs like rope, the sound of ships leaving without promises. They didn't talk about the POW camps, not often, not openly. It was easier to remember the honor of those who died than the shame of having lived, easier to speak of valor than surrender, easier to bow at the shrine than ask what happened after capture. But Kazuo remembered. Not because he chose to. Because he had no other choice. The boy he treated one spring, a burn across his back from his father's cigarette, returned that summer with a drawing. It was crude, charcoal on wrapping paper, but the lines were unmistakable. A man in a white coat kneeling beside a boy, handing him something round. Water or medicine, or maybe just hope. Kazuo pinned the drawing near the entryway. Below it, he wrote a name in Roman letters, not his own. Helen. Patients asked who it was. He only ever gave the same answer, a nurse. When they asked where she was now, he said, far but near. In Minneapolis, Helen's hair had turned silver at the edges. She still worked long after she could have retired. Her fingers weren't as quick, but her voice never wavered. She still called every patient darlin' or soldier, depending on the mood. One morning, she received a small package with foreign stamps and no return address. Inside was a pressed cherry blossom and a photograph. The outside of a clinic, a tree, a name on a sign. No note, no explanation, but she knew. She stood in her kitchen for a long time, holding the flower between her fingers. Then she framed it, placed it next to the only photograph she had taken during the war, a candid shot of her younger self in fatigues, squatting next to a Japanese boy with a bandaged leg, both of them smiling at something off camera. It was the only time she had ever smiled in uniform. In 1955, when the Tokyo Broadcasting Service aired a program on post-war reconciliation, they interviewed former prisoners of war and medical staff. Kazuo wasn't interviewed. He didn't volunteer. But someone who had passed through his clinic recognized his name, wrote a letter, asked if the story they'd heard was true, that a former Imperial soldier had been treated by American nurses and later became a nurse himself. Kazuo didn't answer. Instead, he sent a single photograph. The outside of his clinic, the cherry tree in full bloom, a child on the steps holding a doll, and beneath it 4 words written carefully in English. We heal, we remember. There were hundreds of camps, thousands of prisoners, and not every story ended like his. Some ended in fire, some in cruelty, some in silence. But somewhere, in a corner of a battlefield stained by too much blood, one wounded soldier had been offered water. And instead of punishment, he found care. Instead of hate, he found hands that did not shake. Instead of war, he found Helen. Some stories never make it into textbooks. They don't win medals or change treaties. They exist only in the memory of those who lived them, passed like seeds between generations, quiet, unassuming, but impossible to forget. This was one of them. And in that small space between wound and healing, hate and mercy, soldier and nurse, something else was born. Not surrender, not victory, but grace.